Foreign help on the front lines of Libya's civil war. The United Nations accuses several nations of violating an arms embargo. How are outside powers redrawing the battle lines of this conflict, and can they be stopped? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Nastasya Tay. Foreign powers are making the fighting in Libya's 8-year-long civil war even worse. A draft UN report is accusing several nations of violating arms embargoes and amplifying what it calls a proxy conflict. In the past year, UN investigators have found that Jordan, Turkey and the United Arab Emirates routinely and sometimes blatantly supplied weapons, and soldiers from Chad and Sudan were deployed on the ground. Both sides in the war received foreign help, the UN-recognised government in Tripoli and forces loyal to warlord Khalifa Haftar. The experts say it's highly probable that a jet from a Haftar ally launched the airstrike that killed 53 refugees at a migrant centre near Tripoli in July. The report doesn't name the country, but both the UAE and Egypt have warplanes supporting Haftar. A Sudanese military spokesman denied the findings of the report.
There are none of our armed forces in Libya. The report mentioned the name of the leader of the Rapid Support Forces, which is part of the Sudanese military and answers to its general commander. The Sudanese military forces cannot participate in any neighbouring country without an official order, which is a sovereign issue. The decision to go to war or to send troops outside can take place by a sovereign order or presidential order from the head of state. This report, when it speaks about the participation of a force from our military, has no truth on the ground. Our forces don't function in Libya.
And just last month, the UN Special Envoy to Libya urged foreign nations to stop breaking the arms embargo.
Especially since the foreign interference in this war became even more blatant, either in terms of violations of the arms embargo, especially with the arms embargo, but also possibly with direct presence on the ground of mercenaries. The potential presence of the ground of trainers or manipulators of the drones, and a clear internationalization of the conflict.
Now, Libya's areas of control are mainly divided between two rival powers. The United Nations recognised Government of National Accord, or GNA, controls Tripoli, that's in the west. Now, most Western countries support the GNA, as do Turkey and Qatar. Now, in the east is the Tobruk-based parliament. That's the centre of power for Khalifa Haftar. And he's backed by Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Sudan and the United Arab Emirates. The UN-recognised government accuses Russia of deploying mercenaries to the front lines near Tripoli and is urging the US to help end the conflict. Russia has denied having fighters in Libya. Well, let's bring in our guests now. Anas El-Gomati is the founder and general director of the independent think tank, the Sadeq Institute, and he joins us from London. In Beirut is Elias Farhat, a retired military general. And also joining us from London is Imad Badi. He's a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute. Welcome to you all. Now, we have heard quite a lot from Qasem Soleimani over the last few months. And I recall back in May, he warned that the arms embargo then was already on its way to becoming, he used the phrase, a cynical joke. Is that what's happened, Anas? Is the arms embargo now a joke?
Well, it's been a joke for the last 5 years. And I think since Libya's second civil war in 2014, which was sparked by no other than Khalifa Haftar, was only made possible because he was supported by UAE and Egyptian F-16s at the time, 25th of August when they started those strikes in Tripoli, but also just the blatant violations of the arms embargo ever since. I mean, the fact that he moved from a little foothold in Benghazi to the outskirts of Tripoli in 4 years wasn't out of luck. It was because of the arms embargo violations and the ambivalence of the international community to stop him from doing so.
Elias, let me ask you then, you're a retired military general yourself. How do we know exactly where the weapons are coming from and how are they actually getting into Libya?
It's not a secret to know how come the weapons. As for the government of Mr. Sarraj, which is recognized internationally, Qatar and Turkey deal with it as the official and the legitimate government, and the supply of arms is any supply with any sovereign state. But on the other side, General Khalifa Haftar's army receives not only weapons, but also warships and air defense missiles, and reinforces with 1,000 Sudanese troops, which is, great meddling in the Libyan affairs by the new Sudanese regime. This is all a breach or a violation for the international community resolution to embargo the flow of weapons to Libya. So the international community, unfortunately, is silent through this breach. And it was clear when General Haftar launched an attack against Tripoli and stopped on the suburbs of Tripoli, and the international community were looking at the victims and the people displaced and killed, and without doing any response to this attack, and without
we are going to dig in a little more into the international community shortly, but I do want to dig in a little deeper now into these 1,000 Sudanese troops that you just mentioned there, Ilyas. Imad, I'm going to ask you about this because these are members of the Rapid Support Forces who, as we know, were the rebranded Janjaweed, essentially, from Darfur. And these were deployed by Hemeti, who's now the deputy head of the Sovereign Council in Sudan. So in your mind here, what are Hemeti's motivations here? Is this about money?
Well, there was a UN report of the panel of experts, actually, not of Libya, but of Sudan back in January, that highlighted that there was engagement of Darfuri rebels on both sides of the Libyan conflict, predominantly for financial reasons. However, they have been more somewhat constructive or more utilized by Haftar in his advance, and belatedly after what had happened in Sudan, a Canadian lobbying firm has allegedly, based on the leaks of the current UN panel of experts report on Libya, have helped strike a financial deal whereby Hemeti would actually supply Haftar with weapons and mercenaries.
This is actually, there's quite a lot of specifics in this report. The report also specifies the type of plane that carried out this airstrike on the Tajura migrant camp that killed these 53 refugees. And they say it's a Mirage 2000-9 plane. Mr. Farhad, I believe those planes usually come from the UAE or Egypt?
Yes, for sure. The warplanes, they came from United Arab Emirates. They make no secret of that. They are supporting General Haftar, and General Haftar visits periodically the United Arab Emirates and talks with them, and receive fund, and they receive also weapons. And it's their battle here. It's considered their battle in Libya. And you know that this intervention started since 2011, when what's so-called the Libyan revolutions against Gaddafi. There were many medals and supports from the United Arab Emirates to groups in Libya, of them General Khalifa Haftar.
Well, also, since then, the way that this whole conflict has been carried out has also changed. I see that the UN is estimating that just in the past 6 months, the two sides have conducted more than 900 drone missions. And so when this assault began on Tripoli back in April, lots of people said that Haftar had this advantage because he was using these drones. And the report specifies these are Chinese-made drones that came from the UAE, but each of these costs $2 million. So, Anas, you tell me, where is Haftar getting his money from?
Well, I think it's a wider question here, and I think this is, just to go back to your original question for a moment, you know, the arms embargo violation didn't start on April 4th when Haftar started his attack on Tripoli. The irony here is the airbase which they're using in eastern Libya, the UAE's own airbase, was being completed during the UN's mediation in 2014. So whilst the UN was bringing over Libyans to try and struggle towards conducting a peace deal, the UAE was building a war base in Libya to prepare for another war. Now, the UN knew this and did nothing about it, hasn't condemned them, hasn't tried to attempt to sanction them, but they built their first overseas base inside of Libya, in the town of Al-Khadim, in eastern Libya, and they've been using that for 5 years. Now, in other cities where Khalifa Haftar started his first war, in Benghazi, they displaced 100,000 civilians. In the second city of Derna, where his second campaign was, he killed, injured, or displaced a quarter of the population using those very drones. In fact, using drones that were not only supplied by the UAE, but were operated with air tractors by Eric Prince, formerly of Blackwater. All of these things are known not only in this report, but in the reports that have been published over the last 5 years. So there's an irony here that we think that it's just a flash in the pan or just another moment. But this has been going on for 5 years. The true question here is, why has no one looked to try to stop it earlier? And why has the condemnation or even the veiled criticism only started now, when this is nothing new under the sun? It's been going on for 5 years.
Sure, but with all of these different drones, and exactly, that is the question that I want to ask, and I'll let you go for it, Anas, but I also want to direct it at Imad after that. Go ahead.
Well, very briefly, Khalifa Haftar has been using some quite exotic techniques to try to acquire and to create wealth in eastern Libya. And the first is that he created a military investment authority, which has effectively destroyed so much of Libya's public resources, the homes of people that have been displaced, state infrastructure, to scrap it for metal. And scrap metal now is a $1 billion industry, a net exporter of one of the highest in the world now in eastern Libya. And that's going towards, to fulfilling and sustaining his push towards Tripoli. But the most peculiar of all, I think, is the breaking or the shattering of international financial norms by Russia, who printed at least 12 billion dinars and shipped them, counterfeit money that is. It's the first time it's happened in history. And they've been shipping this over to Libya for the last 3.5 years. And that's something that has gone on to not only sustain the war, but it's breaking an international financial norm that they're creating counterfeit money, Mickey Mouse money, and sending it to Libya. And then the sovereign central bank in Tripoli is forced to accept it. So, it's not only the fact that he's making money, it's how he's making that money. And the second question is, when he uses that money to spend it on weapons, who is he putting it in the hands of? And I think your second speaker in Beirut mentioned that it was in the hands of an army. It's anything but an army, as you've shown, and as the statements have already demonstrated. It's mercenaries, it's Russian mercenaries, it's people that have not only come just to fight for money, but we don't know their ideological background. There are many of them that are Saudi-inspired, radical Salafis, the Madkhalis that have been used and referenced in previous reports. So it's really chaotic when you think of the micro picture as well as the macro one.
Well, Anas, you're talking about all of this cash that's being shipped around, right? And I see that just in the last couple of weeks, Malta said it stopped a huge shipment of unofficial Libyan banknotes, and they said it was 256 cubic meter containers of cash. That's a huge amount. And they think that it came from a Russian mint. So, Imad, let me ask you, how reliant is the LNA then on Russian support?
Well, there's a big question here. Well, your first question is quite pertinent in the sense that the big question right now is whether Haftar is actually paying for the weapons he's getting and whether this conflict can drag on given the amount of finances that he has to spend or the amount of money he has to mobilize in order to pay everyone, co-opt tribes, co-opt local armed groups, etc., etc. So the big question is right now whether Haftar will actually aim to dethrone, and his international allies actually dethrone, the governor of the central bank in future political negotiations in order for him to be able to continue his economic war, let's say. Because aside the war that's been happening on the ground, there has been, as Anas pointed out, there has been an economic war that's been waged in the sense that Haftar has predated over revenue generation mechanisms in the east. He's created his own, this mobilization authority that was also rumored to have been established in the past couple of weeks. And this is a mobilization authority that would actually be particularly aimed at gathering finances to finance this war, this Tripoli offensive in particular. So now the big question is what happens to the Libyan economy and whether Haftar and his international allies will seek to weaponize the economy and seek to actually allow Haftar to continue gathering finances and gathering money in order to take over Libya economically, not just militarily.
Sure. Let me ask you a follow-up there, Imad, because I just want to throw this figure at you. $25 billion of debt is apparently around, and this was actually back in April, this report that Haftar had run up $25 billion of debt. if he runs out of cash, could that mean there's an opportunity then for a de-escalation of the conflict, or do you just not see it going that way?
Well, the idea now is that since the loss of Gharian that occurred in, if I'm not mistaken, late June, since the loss of Gharian, Haftar has essentially been extremely reliant on foreign airstrikes or foreign operated drone strikes to maintain his war effort. So at this point in time, it is rumored that the international allies of Haftar are basically trying to improve his military, or improve sort of the military conditions of this war to allow him to have a favorable position ahead of a political settlement. So the idea right now is that if that happens, and we don't know what are the factors based on what they're assessing, this exactly what are favorable conditions to Haftar in this particular environment. But if that happens, then that's where the international allies will step in to actually help Haftar gain an advantage, whether it be political, economic, or even on the security front.
Well, speaking of international allies, I think this is a good point. I want to play you a video from a year ago, right? So this whole video was released by the Libyan National Army, that's Khalifa Haftar's forces. And this is him, he's on a visit to Moscow. This is November last year. And there he is, he's greeting the Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu. But there's also someone else who's very influential at this meeting. And we're seeing him now walk into that meeting. And I'm going to try to stop that shot there. Let's take a look at that shot of Haftar as he's walking into the meeting room. Now, the man behind Haftar, who then goes on to participate in this meeting, that's Yevgeny Prigozhin. He's the head of the Wagner Group. I'm going to ask you, Elias, as someone who's been involved in the military yourself, tell us a little more about this man and the outfit that he runs. They were also, I believe, involved in Syria.
Yes, the Wagner Group is a private security company in Russia. The first of its tasks was in Donetsk in eastern Ukraine, where they supported the separatists in Ukraine and to build their own political entity in that part. Now we've heard about it in Syria as well, in the mountains of Latakia and in the Syrian deserts. This is where Russia needs deniability in any action that should be taken by these groups, maybe massacres or something like this. The same as the private security groups in Iraq, called Blackwater and others. Now the news that they are joining Khalifa Haftar in eastern Libya is very dangerous because they are not recognized in Russia officially, but practically they are taking part in the conflict in Libya with one side, with General Haftar, and of course they do that to get money, and a large amount of money, millions of dollars. So who will pay this money? Khalifa Haftar and his supporters will pay them the money, and the tasks that they execute in this fight is the dirty tasks to attack some places, some special targets. And so I think that Russia is not officially supporting Haftar, but it's practically through Wagner Group doing a good job for Mr. Haftar to advance in the Libyan territory.
Well, we have heard this number of about 200 mercenaries potentially in Libya, and we've been also hearing reports from hospitals who are now seeing different kinds of gunshot wounds that look like they're coming from sniper rifles, various different reports like that. So, Anas, tell me, what do you think Russia's trying to achieve here? What do they want to achieve out of this conflict?
Russia's playing a very, very precarious game that has very little actually to do with Libya, because when you look at actually who they've supported, Prigozhin is actually a very good place to start, because two of his associates were arrested at the beginning of the conflict in April in Tripoli, and their hard drives were scanned, and documents were found that they were trying to reach out to Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, the former leader of the country's son, who has been in prison and has almost disappeared for the last 6 years in trying to create a bid for him or an electoral bid for him. And they're also well known to have worked on troll farms, which were investigated as part of the Mueller report early last year. So this is something that is also quite strange because they're working with that faction, but they've also signed deals, economic deals with the GNA, the Tripoli-backed government, over the last 12 months. So a wheat deal of worth over $1 billion. Rosneft, the national Russian oil company, has signed a deal with the GNA in late 2016. So when you look at what they're doing, they're actually working with everyone. And what their strategy is to destabilize the country, to disrupt the relationships that the GNA has, that the LNA has, that even Saif al-Islam may have with all of these Western partners, so that when it comes to a negotiation, the West fears this mammoth-sized Russia, that wherever it looks, left, right, or center, it finds them there, and then it has to bargain and negotiate with them. And their bargaining position is going to be quite strong, and the negotiation will have very little to do with Libya because they're more interested in EU sanctions on Ukraine and Crimea, and they're trying to get out of that. And Libya is just a theatre or even a pantomime for that kind of play. So it should be seen in its wider context. They found the perfect spoiler with Haftar because he'll fight to the last mercenary. So, with him, it's very, very easy to try and give him external support and backing. He's looking for it, but it goes beyond him, and it goes beyond what most Western countries, particularly those in Libya's neighbourhood, in the EU or the European southern neighbourhood, are concerned about, which is that kind of destabilization that will lead to migration flows or even the re-emergence of ISIL in Libya's Saharan region. That's where the fears of European policymakers are, and their worry is that this protracted conflict will only exacerbate those two issues, that they'll have to negotiate with Russia. The clear issue I have with this is that if we misplace our assessment of where Russia is, what it's doing, and what it hopes to achieve, and we think it's a surface level, they just want Haftar like the UAE and France or Russia, the UAE, Egypt and France, then it actually conceals the role of the ideological partners of Haftar, like the UAE and like Egypt, who are not just in it for the money or in it for the financial gain or any small political gain. They existentially need Libya to not become a civilian state, to basically not become Tunisia, not become a successful democratic transition. It's either got to look like Yemen, a failed state, or it's got to look like Egypt, an authoritarian state. And if we focus so much on Russia, we conceal those two actors, and the problems that could arise in future negotiations, those that are looming now in Berlin, is that the West fears a very, very strong, robust Haftar with Russian support. So they say, well, pull him away from Russia and give him to actors and international actors that we like the Egyptians, like the UAE, trusted partners in the region, and that's just maintaining the status quo. That still leaves Libya with a very old 78-year-old man that, again, will try and fight with more mercenaries or to the last mercenary, and it still leaves Libya in the midst of a civil war that will not stop unless, and that's the key point here, when you look at the way that Haftar has mobilized his forces, he has to pay for them. When you look at what's happened in the west of Libya, all of those civilians that put their weapons down in 2011 have come back up again to fight without any money. I am going to stop you there because I do want to bring Imad into this discussion as well. And part of the reason I want to talk about what's happening with Russia, but also Western powers, is you mentioned there, Anas, this Berlin conference. And the Berlin conference was supposed to have happened in October, then it was going to be in November. Now they're talking about potentially next year. It really feels like this international peace process has stalled somewhat. So, Imad, what is the reason for the delay, and is there any kind of hope of resolution here?
Okay, well, I'll jump on a point that maybe Elias mentioned earlier with regards to the Russian, and also relates to what Anas mentioned. The engagement of on the Russian side in the conflict in Libya is not new. The engagement of PMCs, private military contractors like Wagner, they have been engaged on Haftar's side for a while now, for about 3 years almost. Now, the difference is in the past few months, what we have seen is a transition from their location. They're actually rumored to be actively participating at the front line. So that's a big change, given also the primitive type, the way the Libyan conflict is fought on the ground. A group of 100 people is really a group of 100 mercenaries, let's say, that have previous battle experience is really a significant problem. So that's one side of things. The other side of things, as you mentioned with regards to Berlin, is that because the conflict is being intractable in this way, and because also the preparatory meetings, the Germans are actually trying to push for all sides to be neutral or abide by certain rules. That means that it hasn't been held, because most of the actors currently engaged on the Libyan conflict view things in zero-sum terms.
Well, there's going to be a lot more negotiations around this topic, and I'm sure we'll all be following them very closely. Thank you so much for your time today. Thank you to all our guests. That's Anas El Gomati, Elias Farhat, and Emad Badi. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Nastasya Tay, and the whole team here in Doha, bye for now.